Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 200 libraries across 37 states with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the wonderful best-selling, prize-winning, and acclaimed authors that you will hear from throughout our Author Talk series year-round. Today, we are honored and excited to host highly acclaimed author and negotiation expert Kwame Christian as he presents some highlights of his newest book, How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race, Practical Tools for Necessary Change in the Workplace and Beyond. Before we jump in, let me pause for one moment and give you all that standard housekeeping information, and then I'll introduce our guest and turn things over to him. We have compiled some viewer questions that were pre-submitted with registration, but we will also be taking your additional questions throughout this entire presentation. So when you have a direct question for Kwame, please click that questions button that's below the live stream video to submit your question as we progress through the webinar. In addition, we invite you to interact with your fellow viewers in the live chat box, also located below this stream. And I know that Kwame will have some questions for you all, and you can put those in the live chat box as well. Today, Kwame will present for the first 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will hold an audience Q&A for the last 15 to 20 minutes of our hour. And as a reminder, if you're unable to attend the full talk for any reason, you will receive a thank you for attending email in about 24 hours. And in that email, you can find a link to the recording. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today. Kwame Christian is a best-selling author, business lawyer, and the founder and CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, a global consulting firm specializing in negotiation and conflict resolution. In 2018, Kwame released his first book, the best-selling Finding Competence in Conflict: How to Negotiate Anything and Live Your Best Life. Kwame's recently released second book, and book of note for today, How to Have Difficult Conversations About Race, is a relatable guide for helping everyday people navigate one of the most polarizing and important conversations taking place in society. He's also a regular contributor for Forbes and the host of the #1 negotiation podcast in the world, Negotiate Anything, which currently has over 5 million downloads worldwide. An Ohio native, Kwame currently resides in Columbus with his wife, Whitney, and 2 sons, Kai and Dominic. Welcome, Kwame. Thank you so much for being here. I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Glad to be here. Thanks for the invite. Thank you all for attending. It is good to virtually be here with you all today. This is an important topic, so I'm excited to share this information with you. And for me, I enjoy talking about negotiation, conflict resolution, and how it applies to different topics like the conversations about race. And so for me, it is a treat to be able to talk about this. And I like to go on for a long period of time. So I'm going to keep this really short. I guess that's relative because I like to speak for a longer period of time, so about 40 minutes, but I want to give you all an opportunity to engage as well. All right, so let's jump into it. And so let's go ahead and test this chat. What do you hope to get out of this session? And just so you know, there is a 20 or 30-second lag. So as you ask the questions or as you engage, just know I'm not ignoring you. It takes a little bit of time for it to get to me. So when you think about this topic, how to have difficult conversations about race, what are your goals? What do you hope to get out of it? What do you hope to learn? Let's populate the chat and I'll read off a few of them as they come through. Okay. So as those are coming through, I'm going to go through the agenda, how we're going to cover this. So first, we're going to talk about the purpose, why we should still have these conversations about race. The next one is going to be talking about the framework. How do we actually have the conversations? And then lastly, a bit of application as well. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and see. Still taking some time. Listen, peeps, I am serious about engagement. Okay, so go ahead and let those comments fly. And also, one note, I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, ask those questions. So we have a question function toward the end, but if something comes up spur of the moment on a specific slide, on a specific topic, I might be able to catch that and we might be able to answer that question at that time. So I like to see engagement in the chat as you are listening. All right, cool. Let's continue on. All right, so we're going to talk about the purpose and the challenge. There we go. Here we go. Now they're coming through. Improve skills and strategies, skills and tools that I can implement on this topic, tips on how to be honest but sensitive about race questions, how to stay calm. Yes, emotion management is important. Positivity and an alternative view to the media. Oh, Martha. Yes, the media will have an impact on how these conversations go. Let's leave it as an impact, right? The media will certainly have an impact. Learn to talk to board members that don't think they need to do diversity training. I've heard that one before. Let's read off a couple more. I hope to have tools to foster meaningful discussion about race and our work's role in acknowledging and overcoming it. I would like some insights and tips on how to talk to someone who seems to be buying the talking points that downplay the role of racism in society, to answer real time and keep my cool. Yes, this is good. Okay, peeps, listen, there's some commonality here, right? So we all have a goal that we want to accomplish in these conversations, but we also want tools so we can have these conversations more effectively. And so for me, with this presentation and with the book too, I want to make sure that everything that we talk about is practical. I think with a lot of these books, it's easy to get caught in the theory where we have these really great theoretical ideas. Maybe we focus on data, and data is great. But here's a question. What do we do when facts don't work? What do we do when the data isn't persuasive? Because I'm sure you all have had this situation where you're having these conversations and you're presenting data. You say, okay, this person is at this point in their lives where they have not learned about this topic, and so let me educate them. That's the problem. I'm going to give them some data. I'm going to give them some information. Then what you find out is that, is that the information that you gave them doesn't work. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to turn our passion into persuasion. It's not an issue with the data. It's not an issue with the facts. It might not even be an issue with the rationale and the logic that you use in the conversation. It might be an issue of persuasion. That is a completely different realm. And so for me, what I want to do is take negotiation, conflict resolution, and effective communication skills and bring it to this really important topic. And I know this was like a risky move for me career-wise, but for me, the way that I define negotiation is anytime you're having a conversation and somebody in the conversation wants something. And for me, negotiation is everywhere. We just don't recognize it. And so when we come to these difficult conversations about race and other sensitive issues, to me, I look at it through the lens of negotiation. It's a persuasion issue. And so as you're going through this presentation, I want you all to realize, yes, you will certainly be able to use the skills and tools that we talk about in this presentation in your conversations about race. But you should also realize that you can use these exact same skills in any difficult conversation you are having, okay? And I want to read off one last thing. Somebody said confidence. Confidence, that's what they want. So my first book was Finding Confidence in Conflict, because it doesn't make sense to give recipes to people who are afraid to get in the kitchen. If you Google negotiation skills, you can find a bunch of information, but that's not usually the issue. There's an internal barrier to having these conversations. So like the first quarter of the book is focused on winning the internal battle, helping you to overcome your emotional barriers to having these difficult conversations about these critical topics. Because yes, there is a skills issue where we have to learn the skills of negotiation, conflict resolution, and persuasion, but there's also the internal negotiation that has to happen in order for us to be effective in these conversations. All right. So as you can see, I'm already off script because I get really excited about this, but it's really important. Let's check the chat. Yes, this is really important. This is really important. I saw somebody else asking, how should we refer to people of color, BIPOC members of our community? And that's a tough one too. I had to survey my audience on LinkedIn to figure out what terminology I can use. And if you're at a point in a conversation about a topic that's so important to you and you don't even know what words to use, that can really hurt your confidence too. And so my simple rule is to be as specific and precise as possible whenever possible. So in general, if I'm writing, I usually use BIPOC. If I'm speaking, I tend to use people of color. But if I'm speaking directly to a specific group, then I would say Asian Americans, Black Americans, right? Something like that, right? So I would try to be as specific as possible. All right, let's roll. We should get to a real slide at some point in this presentation. So let's flow. Okay, important question. Why should we have these conversations about race? Why? should we have these conversations about race? All right. So I want, again, fill out the chat. Let's hear from you. Why do you think it's important to have these conversations about race? And as you are answering this question, let me tell you a quick story. So when I was writing this book, writing is hard and it's I like to talk, as you could probably tell. I'm a lawyer, a professor, and a podcaster. So talking is what I like to do. Writing is tough for me. And so I submitted the manuscript and we went through a few rounds of edits. And then my publisher came back to me and they said, Kwame, I think we started at the wrong spot. I said, what do you mean? They said, we haven't clearly articulated why we should be having these conversations at all. And I said, it's obvious. And they're like, well, what's the answer? I don't know if you've ever found yourself in a position where you have to explain the obvious, but it's a really tough situation. Because here's the thing. I'm assuming, if you're here in this presentation now, I'm assuming you think that we should be having these difficult conversations. And again, another assumption, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I'm assuming you've had situations where you were trying to talk to somebody about this topic, but they did not think it was important enough to talk about it, or they did not want to talk about it. And then when you're in that position where you need to explain the obvious, it becomes really, really, really tough, right? And so the fun fact is that chapter 1 of the book, which is why we should have these conversations, is actually the last chapter I wrote. It was the last chapter I wrote. And so it took me a while to even get started, a couple of weeks to even get started, because I remember going through some of the answers that I hear a lot. Diversity is important. We need to treat people respectfully. Diversity helps businesses. So we have a business case for diversity, all those things. But I was like, there's something more fundamental about it that we're missing. And then I figured it out. But let's check the chat to see what you all have come up with. All right. So why should we have conversations? Race is on the national agenda. It needs skills to engage across races. Understand how to talk about white privilege, because U.S. culture is sadly built on inherent racism. It's important to talk about it because racism won't end if we don't talk about it. Important for us as white people to do that work, right? So think about this. What you said, Jesse, at the beginning. It's important to talk about racism because it won't end if we don't talk about it. How in the world do we solve problems without talking about the problems? Right? Because a lot of times people say this isn't the time to talk about it. This isn't the place to talk about it. But when is it? Right? Or we can think about color blindness and we say we don't see race. Well, if we don't see race, then we can't see racism. And if we can't see racism, then we can't address the problems. Right? And all of these answers are correct. But there is something tying all of these things together. And it is one word, 4 letters, and that word is care. Care. We have these conversations about race because we care. We care about each other. We care about progress. We care about improvement, right? We care about solving problems. We care, right? And so when you think about it through that lens, it really becomes quite obvious, but we're able to articulate it. I have these conversations because I care. Now, some people might say, well, I'm not avoiding the conversation because I don't care. And I think that's legitimate. I don't think it's that they don't care. I think it's that they care about other things more than having the conversation about race. So what is it? I think they care about the status quo. The status quo seems safe. And if we tread into the unknown, who knows what that means for me? So I'd rather stay and maintain the status quo. They also care about comfort. Solving problems takes effort. Having conversations about sensitive issues like race takes effort. It is simply more comfortable to stay in your comfort zone, right? And so there are going to be other things that will come up and be prioritized over the conversation about race. So one of the things that we have to do as we're having these conversations is work to impress upon the other person why it's so important for us to continue to have these conversations. All right, peeps, let's keep flowing. So, yeah, let's have some fun with this. What are some examples of conversations about race that come up in your role? So I saw somebody talking about the trying to convince people at work, trying to talk to board members, trying to help people to understand why diversity training is important. Good. This is great. What else? Let's keep flowing. And as we're going, I'm going to read through some of the previous comments. This is great. Thanks for being here. Hey, Angela. You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Yes. So, okay, somebody wants vocabulary to have these conversations. This is good. This is very good. Let's scroll down to the bottom to see what else people are saying. So when are you having these conversations in your role? Boom. Okay. So talking about how to implement diversity, equity, and inclusion in your role at work. This is good. Um, Understanding history. So having historical conversations to understand how we got to where we are right now. That's going to be important. Good. What else? What other examples? And here's the thing. I want to really get deep into this, because when I do my negotiation trainings, I put this slide into every single negotiation or conflict resolution training, and it's just, what is negotiation? And again, my definition is anytime you're having a conversation and somebody wants something. So then I always ask, when are you negotiating? Because a big issue that people run into is that they have low negotiation awareness. They don't recognize when they have an opportunity to negotiate, right? And so I want you to think about all of those situations at work that come up from time to time when race is on the table, when race is an issue of discussion. And one of the things is that it's not always going to be obvious. So this is an important awareness test for everybody. So your answers, you might not think it's that profound, but it might be one of those difficult conversations that somebody else misses. So this is an opportunity for us to support each other by sharing our experiences. Good. This is a good one. In church study groups, this is good. I run a tabletop for RPGs for people online, and race is a major conversation within a lot of those. This is good. Why do we need to do another DEI training? I like the emphasis added. Yes, that's the thing. Well, here's the thing. It's a funny question, right? Because it's like, why do I need to keep on learning? That's interesting. I never really thought I had to explain that, right? In any other profession, in any other thing, we recognize that continuing education is important. I cannot continue to be a lawyer if I'm not taking my continuing education courses, right? And the world is constantly changing, so we need to continue to be at a higher level of knowledge when it comes to understanding other people. Yes, talking with teammates about how best to invest, how best to serve Latin American client families. Good. As an educator, being on this topic is really important. Talking to school leaders, tools and strategies to engage in the conversation. Good. This is really important, right? So these conversations are coming up all the time, and this is why we have to be ready for them. So this is our motto at the American Negotiation Institute: the best things in life are on the other side of difficult conversations. And so when you think about the quality of your life and the measure of your impact, it's most likely going to be largely contingent upon how well or how poorly you're having these difficult conversations every single day, right? And so if we want to create the society that we want to have, if we want to create the workplaces that we want to have and the communities that we want to have, we're going to have to lean in and have these difficult conversations. All right. And so we have to start changing our mindset about what these conversations look like. Because when we are having these conversations, they're going to be something that holds us back. And that is going to be our emotions, our fears. Because a lot of times we're afraid of offending somebody. We're afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. We're afraid of sharing information and the person taking it the wrong way. And then we get labeled inappropriately. We're afraid of being ostracized for what we believe. We're afraid of being canceled, being called a racist, right? There's a lot of risk. And so when the risks are so clear to us, then we just say, you know what? I'm going to step back. I'm not going to have this conversation. It's too risky, too scary. And so what we need to do is we need to start looking at conflict as an opportunity. All of these difficult conversations are an opportunity, right? And so whenever you find yourself hesitant to approach these difficult conversations, just challenge yourself to finish this sentence. This conversation is an opportunity to what? Where is the opportunity? So as it relates to difficult conversations about race, how would you finish that sentence? This conversation is an opportunity to what? Let's just put it in the chat, see what comes out. Because this is really important. Because if you don't see this as an opportunity, most likely you're going to see this as a threat. And if you see it as a threat, you're going to have two main options. Number one, you're going to try to avoid the conversation. Or number two, if the conversation is unavoidable, you're going to have the conversation, but you're not going to be wholeheartedly engaged in the conversation. You're going to be playing it safe. You're going to be afraid of being vulnerable, and so you're not going to be effective in the conversation. So when it all comes down to it, my methodology is based on efficacy. We need to make sure that we're having these conversations in the most effective way possible. We want to be more goal oriented with the way that we are having these conversations, because a lot of times we get into these conversations and our emotions take over. They get emotional. We get emotional. Now we're having an unproductive conversation. And a number of people in the chat said that emotion management was something that they wanted to focus on. So that's what we're going to talk about today too. So we say this conversation is an opportunity to create a ripple in the pond of public discourse. Love that. An opportunity to learn the other person's point of view and culture. Opportunity for us to step back and evaluate whether our values are aligned with our actions. Opportunity to hear a perspective we've not experienced, to grow personally and collectively, to learn more about the person. This is great. This is great. This is so important. This is really, really important here. Okay. So again, this is an opportunity-based framework. I want you to focus on those opportunities. And so once you see those opportunities, then you're going to lean in. All right. So with the time we have left, we're going to focus on how to actually have the conversation. Okay. So here's the thing. This is what's going to make this really tough. When I talk about how to have the conversation, when I talk about the actual strategy and tactics and things like that, I have worked incredibly hard to keep it as simple as possible. So everything that I talk about will be easy to understand. You will understand everything that I say, but that's not the challenge. The problem isn't understanding what to do. You'll know what to do after this presentation. The challenge is that you will not want to do the things that I'm talking about today. Why? Number one, because they're hard. Number two, because it's an unnatural response to a very natural situation. Responding with empathy to somebody who you do not believe deserves empathy is not a natural way of responding in these difficult conversations. And here's the thing, we have to remember this important fact. Their emotions do not play by our rules. So if you look at somebody and we see a life of privilege, we might not feel like they have the right to feel the way that they do. If we look at somebody and we see a lived experience that we've not had, and we might want to brush it aside, and the person gets upset about that, not surprisingly, their emotions don't play by our rules, right? And so the thing is, it's going to take a lot of discipline, and it's going to take a lot of restraint and a lot of practice in order to put these things into play regularly in your difficult conversations. But I want to start off by empathizing with you. This is not easy. And it's still not easy for me. But a lot of times when we feel as though we're almost fighting our natural inclinations in these conversations, it's not always a sign that you're on the wrong track. Oftentimes it's a sign that you're on the right track, because listening to somebody that you disagree with is really, really hard to do. You're going to want to jump in and counter. But again, we have to remember this. Our goal is efficacy. Our goal is to have productive conversations. And so you don't do these things because you don't listen empathetically or anything like that for any kind of moralistic type of way. I'm not going to moralize this for you, but I'm just going to focus you on what is effective. And empathy, listening, and the framework we're going to talk about today, it is effective, and that's why you should do it. Because these goals that we have, when I talked about the goals, why do we want to have these conversations? Every single goal was bigger than ourselves. And so a lot of times we have to sacrifice what we would want to say in the moment in order to be more effective in the conversation. All right, so here's an example. Calling out versus calling in. So let's use the example of a microaggression. Wherever I present and I'm talking about this, microaggressions are something that come up a lot. And so a simple definition for a microaggression, these are the offensive comments that are made that kind of touch on somebody's identity. And a lot of times they are made unintentionally, or they're made in a way that gives plausible deniability for the intention behind it. And so it's almost like a situation where somebody says something and there's a little bit of a record scratch in your mind, like, hey, was that was that offensive? I don't know. Or it just flagrantly was offensive, but the other person doesn't think that it was offensive, or they didn't mean to be offensive. And that's where it becomes really challenging. And so microaggressions are real and microaggressions have an impact. But I want to let you know that there is nothing innately special about microaggressions as it relates to protected classes of citizens, like a microaggression about race, gender, religion, whatever it happens to be. Because here's the thing. If you spend enough time with human beings, you will undoubtedly offend them. And you will do that without trying to offend them. That is just what happens when human beings spend time together. But when that offense touches on somebody's identity, who they are at their core, that offense hurts a whole lot more. That's why we elevate it to the level of a microaggression. And that's why we're talking about it today. So let's use an example. Let's say we are in a meeting and somebody says something that could be considered racist, that could be offensive. Some people found offense to it. Now we're in a situation where we want to step up. We want to be an ally. We want to be an advocate. We want to create the situation. We want to change the situation for the better. Now let's also say that the comment was made in passing, and now the meeting is going back in the natural direction. So there's not an ongoing threat. So we have a choice: call somebody out publicly in front of everybody else in the meeting, or call them in. And now we want to think about the strategy here. What we want to do is we want to call them in, which is privately after the meeting, calling them aside to have a conversation. Now here's the strategy why. It all comes down to psychology, and it all comes down to being effective. When you think about calling out versus calling in, the reason why it works is because when you are having a conversation with somebody one-on-one, you're having a conversation. But if you're talking to somebody in front of other people, it is no longer a conversation. It has become a presentation where we're not talking to each other, but we're talking through each other so other people can hear. So if you're trying to hold somebody accountable for something that they said or did in front of other people, now they're not able to be vulnerable with you. They're showing off to their friends. They don't want to accept what you're saying, and they're going to fight back. And it makes it much more likely for the conversation to be unproductive. And so what we need to do is we need to call them in, and I'm going to give you a framework for that. Now, I know some of you are saying, well, Kwame, what if the thing that was said was really inappropriate? Other people are latching onto it, and it's not one of those things where it's just a passing comment. We're actually going down a dark path. What do I do in that situation? But how do I also consider the psychology that you just shared about vulnerability and an unwillingness to adjust their position in front of other people? What do I do in that situation? So here's what you do. So what you say is this. First, you treat this kind of like a sporting event. If you're playing sports, there's momentum. Sometimes if you're on the other team and you realize that this team is scoring a bunch of points on you, you say, okay, timeout. I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not good. I need to stop this momentum. This is what we're doing in the meeting. So we say, okay, I just want to pause this conversation really quickly and say, I'm not comfortable with the direction this conversation is going. That's what you say. I want to pause the conversation and say, I'm not comfortable where the conversation is going. That's step one. Then step two, you point. Well, you don't know. You don't point. You metaphorically point. You say somebody's name who's in the meeting. And let's say it's John, right? And so you say the person's name, and then you ask a relevant question that is on topic, that is not on the sensitive or inappropriate topic, right? So we'll say, hey, I just want to pause this conversation. I'm not really comfortable with the way this is going. We were here to talk about XYZ. John, going back to what we were talking about before, what do you think about blank? So the way you control a conversation is by asking questions. You pick somebody specifically by name, so you don't just ask a general question where everybody looks at each other like, who are you talking to? You ask somebody a question on a relevant topic that is not on that sensitive issue. And then for the people who were taking it in the wrong direction, then you can call them in after the meeting. If it's an ongoing threat, you have a different approach, okay? Now, let's talk about how to actually do it. Because when it comes to like the framework's pretty straightforward. Sometimes the toughest part of the conversation is understanding how to even start the conversation. So I'm going to give you a simple framework that you can use to start any difficult conversation, but it works really well in the context of a difficult conversation about race. Situation plus impact plus invitation equals engaged communication. So let's walk through each of these steps, and then we're going to use the same example from before with the microaggression at the meeting in this situation. So situation, what we're going to do is we're going to describe what happened using what I call naked facts. So these are facts that are stripped of all interpretation, all judgment, and all opinion. And so you want to describe what happened in a short way that is still accurate, and it is so clear and sterile that no matter what anybody believes in the situation, they can agree that is in fact what did occur. Then you want to talk about the impact, and you want to personalize the impact. So you're going to say, you're going to talk about the impact that the person had on you with what they did. And you want to personalize it because they might be able to disagree with other things, but they can't disagree with your subjective analysis of the impact what they did had on you, right? And then lastly, invitation. We don't want them to feel ambushed, but at the same time, we're not letting them completely avoid the conversation. So the option we're giving is now or later, right? So let's give an example of how this can start. And the goal here with the way that we're starting this conversation is we want it to be very short, and we want there to be very little that the person can contend with. Because if we get the person disagreeing at this point, now we have bad momentum going into the conversation. So I want this to be an easy entry to the conversation. So going back to the microaggression example, hey, in the meeting earlier today, you said XYZ. And when we're saying XYZ, we're going to talk about we're going to try as close as possible to say what they said in verbatim. And then we will say the impact. So earlier in the day, we had this meeting and you said XYZ, and that made me feel uncomfortable. And I want to have a conversation with you to see what we can do about this, or where we go, where our relationship goes going forward, because we work together and I've enjoyed working with you for the past 2 years. And I'd like to make sure that we can continue to work together at a high level going forward, right? All of that together takes like 20 seconds. And that's a bit of a freestyle too. So situation, impact, invitation. That's a really simple way to start these difficult conversations. All right. So now we're going to talk about level 1 versus level 2 communication. So level 1 communication is all about empathy. We're trying to learn from the other side, figure out what it is that they believe, what they think, what their opinions is, those type of things. Level 2, this is all about persuasion. Now, here's the thing. Sometimes the issue that we have in these conversations is we start to persuade too soon. And I have a question for you. When you think about persuasion, trying to change somebody's perspective, what is the danger of trying to persuade the other side too soon? What is the danger of starting off the conversation where you disagree and where you think the other person should change? Tell me what you think. Let's go. Let's see where we go from here. And I see some great conversations here. I think that's why people get defensive when they're called out for racism. Their beliefs and identity feel questioned, so they get emotional. Boom. Great point. Now, let me extrapolate on this as we get comments on my last question. The reason why these conversations about race are so emotional, there's a heightened level of emotionality, it's because of 2 reasons. Number 1, morality, and number 2, identity. Number 1, when we're talking about morality, those are questions of what it means to be a good or bad person. When it comes to identity, we're talking about what does a person like me do or say or believe in these situations, right? And so if somebody is called out for racism, what in their mind, they get defensive because they say, oh no, I'm not racist. I'm a good person. And so while you might be having the conversation in order to address an issue to make things better, they might be having the conversation with the goal of protecting themselves and making sure that you know that they are not a bad person. And so the defensiveness that we talk about and that frustrates us is actually a very predictable response, right? So let's get into these answers. So why do we start off with empathy and listening and learning? Because if we start off persuading too soon, like Stephanie said, it causes offense. Bingo. Because it puts up walls for further communication. We might unintentionally push buttons we're not even aware of. Yes, they dig in. It creates cognitive dissonance. They don't hear. They're talking too much. They're thinking too much about what they want to say. It turns into a debate. Exactly. It's just sequencing issue, right? This is really important. And so again, here's the thing. When you get somebody give somebody an opportunity to talk and explain themselves, a fascinating thing can happen. A lot of human beliefs are built on inherent contradictions that we're not consciously aware of. So if you ask questions and you empathize, and your goal isn't to change their mind at this stage in the conversation, it's just to understand, then you realize, wait a second, as they're talking, they realize themselves, wait a second, what I said now and what I said 2 minutes ago, those two things don't match up. This is the first time they're realizing it. And by asking these questions, you're helping them to do that work, that internal work that they should have done before. So a lot of times in these conversations, my goal, like I said, with level 1 communication, my goal is to understand and gather information, but it's a little bit deeper than that, because I want to act as if I am their internal voice. I'm doing that work that they should have done before. I'm going to ask them questions that they should have explored. And now that they can do that, they might organically change their perspective without me even needing to get to level 2 persuasion, right? That's better. And that is stickier, because they're not saying, wow, I talked to Kwame and he changed my mind, or I talked to Kwame and he bullied me into changing my perspective. No, I talked to Kwame, and while talking to Kwame, I started to see things differently, and I chose to change my mind. That is lasting persuasion. That's why we sequence the conversations this way. All right, so we're going to talk about the compassionate curiosity framework. This is our mental model for how we have these conversations. It was debuted in my TED Talk called Finding Confidence in Conflict, and I started the idea a little bit deeper in my book called Finding Confidence in Conflict, and then again deeper with how to have difficult conversations about race. And with this slide, you're learning something really important about me. Naming things is hard. Okay, cool. Finding Confidence in Conflict. What will I call my book? Finding Confidence in Conflict. Okay, what's my second book about? How to have difficult conversations about race. That sounds like a title to me. So yes, compassionate curiosity framework. Let's talk about it. So like we said, the thing is that makes these difficult conversations so tough is the emotional states. And so we need to have a framework that addresses the emotionality of the parties involved. If you get the books, you'll see that the framework was designed not only for the external conversation, but also the internal conversation. Sequenced the exact same way, it can be a tool of emotion management for yourself, introspection and self-reflection, and also bias reduction. So you have an actual systematic framework for that internal negotiation that has to happen. So step 1 is acknowledge emotions, feelings, and beliefs. Step 2 is get curious with compassion. Step 3 is joint problem solving, and it helps you to know what to say and when to say it for maximum impact. So if the person is emotional, we know exactly what to do. Acknowledge and validate emotions. The emotions have dissipated. Great. We can transition into getting curious with compassion, asking open-ended questions with a compassionate tone to gather information. We're still in level 1 communication here. And then once we feel as though the person has fully expressed themselves and we have enough information, we understand the situation, then we can transition to number 3, which is joint problem solving, where we work with them. But what happens if they get emotional in joint problem solving? We know exactly what to do. Emotions, boom, step 1, right? And so it helps you to flow. It helps you to flow really organically and smoothly during these conversations. So let's go through the steps. Step 1, acknowledge and validate emotions. And I'm going to start this off with, I already addressed that, so we can skip that. I'm going to start this off with a quote. There's no point in sending a message if they're not psychologically ready to receive it. And listen, peeps, I like to have fun. So let's do a little trivia here. Who do you think said this quote? Where did this quote come from? I'll give you some time to populate the chat. So the question is, who said these words? Where did this quote come from? So let's extrapolate on this point. There's no point in sending a message if they're not psychologically ready to receive it. So you can say the right thing at the wrong time and fail for that reason. Okay? So we need to make sure that we're approaching these conversations where we can actually lead the person to a mental and emotional state where they can actually be receptive of the data that we want to share. So it's not that facts don't matter at all. They certainly do matter. It's not like the data doesn't matter and the logic. Those things matter. But the problem is we often introduce those to the conversation at the wrong time. So timing is important. So we need to make sure we're walking them to rationality during these conversations. There's a strategy for that. So let's see what you come up with for the trivia. Who made this quote? Martin Luther King, Dr. Seuss, Carl Jung. Ooh, you're close. That's good. And I see Obama. No. I see 2 people guessing Kwame Christian. That is preposterous. I don't know what kind of narcissist would quote himself in his own presentation. Okay. It was my quote. I put it in both of my books. So yes, y'all were right. You caught me. You caught me. All right. So remember this important point. There's a difference between being right and being persuasive. So you might be objectively correct in what it is that you're saying, but it might not be enough to be persuasive, right? So we have to make sure that we're paying attention to the psychology and being more persuasive and not just focusing on being right. Because if we focus on being right, then it becomes an argument. Arguments are not productive, nor are they persuasive. Okay. When you think about the emotions that you've seen in these difficult conversations about race, what comes up? What comes to mind? What are some of the emotions that you've seen, either in yourself or in other people, as it relates to the conversations that you've had day to day about race? Let's list off some of the emotions that you've seen, and I'll give you I'll walk you through how to address those emotions in these conversations too. Thanks, Lily. I don't think a narcissist would host a webinar like this. That's good. That is good. So yes, what are some of the emotions you've seen? And as those come through the chat, I'll walk you through how to do this. And listen, we don't need to freestyle. We're not freestyling here. Okay. We're going to acknowledge and validate the emotions. And so we're going to label the emotion saying it sounds like, it seems like, or if it's really obvious, I can tell that. Okay. And we're going to label the emotion. And let me say very briefly psychologically why this works. So if you are in therapy, they use a technique called affect labeling, AFFECT. And so what happens is when you label the emotions, it calms you down. And here's why. If you're emotional, your amygdala is firing. But if you're calmer, if you're using your higher level thinking, you're using your frontal lobe. This is where you have the prefrontal cortex. It has emotion management, executive function, logical reasoning, all of those things. But the problem is that there's an antagonistic relationship between the amygdala and the frontal lobe. So the more emotional you are, the less clearly you're thinking. The more clearly you're thinking, the less emotional you are. It's an either or proposition. And so when you acknowledge and validate the emotion by labeling the emotion, it triggers a part of the frontal lobe that calms the person down. Because in order to, the amygdala feels the emotion, but the frontal lobe, a portion of the frontal lobe, labels the emotion. So by activating the frontal lobe, they calm down. So let's see what emotions come up. Denial, disappointment, anger, being misunderstood, feelings of superiority, insecurity, fear, doubt, anger, embarrassment, shame. Exactly. Defensiveness, disdain, obvious stupidity. Oh my gosh. Bev, I'm not sure if that's an emotion. Maybe more of an observation. But yes, let's stick with some of the other emotions. Okay. So here's what we say. For me, I like to play it safe with the emotional label. So somebody who's feeling angry, sad, those type of things, sometimes people don't want to accept that emotion, even though it's accurate. And I'm not saying one emotion is better than the other. Okay, I want to be clear about that. But some people are more willing to accept some than others. So I like to use frustration because it can cover a whole bunch of different things. So correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like you're a little bit frustrated with the way this situation is unfolding. Or I can tell that you really care about this situation. Or correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're not really comfortable with what I'm suggesting. Whatever it is, right? And so you label the emotion, then how they're going to respond is they're going to vent, they're going to share, they're going to extrapolate. And this is where it gets really tough because they are most likely going to hit you with information that you disagree with. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to jump in and counter it. Boom, counter. You're wrong because of this. No, that doesn't make sense because of that. Boom, 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 boom. Not the time. You will have your time. Right now, we're focusing on empathy. Right now, we're focusing on lowering the emotional temperature of the room. So if somebody says something to me with emotions, I ignore the fact. I'm aggressively using air quotes here. When I say fact, I ignore the fact and I focus on the emotion and I address the emotion alone. Because amazing things happen when the emotions go away. If the person is able to let go of that defensiveness and feel safer with you in that conversation where they can actually be vulnerable, a lot of times what ends up happening is that these really strongly held positions and beliefs tend to dissipate with the emotions. The calmer they get, the less tightly they hold on to these problematic beliefs. Okay, so let's move on. So that's you do this until the person feels a little bit calmer. And then you get curious with compassion. Right here, what we're talking about is we're asking open-ended questions with a compassionate tone. Okay. And the reason why we do this is because of the reality of mirror neurons. So think about if you're in a room and somebody yawns, other people start to yawn, right? Why is that? It's because of mirror neurons. And these are nerve receptors in the brain that reflect back the emotions that they see. That's why if somebody who you don't even know might look at you and smile, you might automatically find yourself smiling, right? But the opposite is also true. They will reflect back the negativity they see. So we need to be mindful of our tone. Question: have you ever been in a conversation and somebody accused you of yelling, but you did not think you were yelling? Has that happened to anybody? Where you're in a conversation, somebody says, "Hey, stop yelling." And you're like, "I wasn't yelling." Right? So here's a fun fact. You were yelling, and yelling isn't about volume or decibel levels. It's about tone. You sounded like a joke, like a jerk, right? You sounded mean. So this is really important. Now, let me be very, very clear. There's a concept called tone policing. This is not tone policing. Tone policing is where you are focusing on somebody else's tone and you're chastising them for feeling emotional about the problems that they're facing. So a lot of times tone policing is used to discount the negative impacts that other people are feeling, because you're saying, I don't like the way that you're saying that, but you're not addressing the problem that the person is bringing to you. This happens a lot of times to women and people of color too. So you see inequity and then you say, hey, this isn't fair. And somebody says, hey, I don't like the way that you said that. Can you watch your tone? Stop being an angry black man, or whatever it happens to be, right? That's not what I am talking about today. I'm talking about you, yourself as an individual, making sure that you're bringing the tone to the conversation that helps you to meet your ultimate goals. And a lot of times that takes a lot of restraint. And a lot of times too, you don't know how you sound to other people. So this is a tool that I used for myself to adjust the way that I talk in my conversations. So when it came to people that I care about, like colleagues at work or my family, I would ask them after a difficult conversation, how did I make you feel during the conversation? Not how did I perform? What did you think? I said, how did I make you feel? And sometimes I would have feedback for the way that I was presenting myself. And so for me, I realized my tendency is, as I get more upset, is I talk faster and louder. And so my mantra for myself is low and slow. Lower my volume, slow down my pace. So the more upset I get, the more mindful I am of that, because I want to make sure that I'm using the tone that makes the person feel safe. If I don't, then the person feels unsafe and now they get emotional again. And I just worked through step one, addressing the emotionality. So I don't want to be less effective because of my tone. All right. Last point. This is the easiest part of the conversation. This is joint problem solving. This is where we're working together with the other side to figure out what our relationship looks like going forward. How do we solve this problem together? I call it future-focused problem solving. We're looking to the future and making sure that we're addressing the situation at hand and making sure that we're making things better in the future. This should feel like a joint problems. This should feel like a joint brainstorming session, really. But you have to recruit them in to the conversation and the solution, because collaboration builds commitment. The more involved they are in the process of the solution building, the more likely they are to adhere and actually have buy-in to what it is that we do in the future. So yes, I hope this was helpful. I wanted to keep it short, managed to get it down within 50 minutes. But before I get to the questions, I just want to shout out the podcast. So we have 3 podcasts. We have Negotiate Anything and Negotiate Real Change. So Negotiate Anything, that's our flagship show, like 680 episodes now. And I think about it in terms of intellectual cross-training. We're learning from people of all different industries, like people in sales, lawyers, people who are in politics, people who are like interrogators, hostage negotiators, relationship therapists, teachers. Everybody has difficult conversations and everybody has a different style, and we can learn from their styles and incorporate it in what we do. Negotiate Real Change is all about using negotiation and conflict resolution to improve your workplace and your community. So addressing issues like DEI. And then we have a Spanish podcast called Negociación desde Cero, hosted by Simon Perez. And so it's our Spanish language negotiation program. And so if you're interested in connecting, make sure you connect with me on LinkedIn. I post something every single day. And if you're interested in a workshop, check out our website, AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com. I think a link is going to come your way for that. But we still have a little bit of time. Let's get to the questions.
Okay. And boy, do we have a lot of great questions. Let's start off with Julie. She says, how do white allies find appropriate, useful resources on their own without burdening our friends of color by asking them to do the legwork for us?
Brilliant question. And to that point, let me give a little context to everybody. So one of the challenges when it comes to these conversations about race and other sensitive issues is that a lot of times there's a burden of education that's put on the person who is in the marginalized community. So you might ask your Black friend about the Black experience, but a lot of people are asking those questions, and it becomes really burdensome. And so the best thing that you can do before you come and ask, because I'm not saying don't ask. I'm not saying don't ask. I'm saying that you want to make sure that you've done your research. You want to make sure that you've used the power of Google, and you want to make sure that if appropriate, you've read the appropriate books. And so you want to not only do that research for yourself, but also show that you've done that research coming into the conversation. So you say, "Hey, I have a question for you, and this is an important thing. I want to let you know that you don't have any obligation to say yes to this. If you don't feel comfortable in any way, I want you to say no to me because I value our relationship too much. For me, I'm trying to be an ally, and I had a question about XYZ. I did a lot of research. I looked at this article, I read this book, and I still have a few questions. Would you mind helping me out?" And again, like I said, if you don't feel comfortable, feel free to say no. I think empowering people to reject your offer is a major part of that equation, because sometimes people feel obligated, and they might feel a little bit of social pressure to say yes even if they don't want to. But I always want to make sure that I reassert the fact that somebody can still say no to me and our relationship is still intact. So I think that's the best way to go about doing it.
Great, thank you. I want to ask Jody's question. She says, I teach Introduction to Sociology, freshman college online. Any suggestions on creating a discussion that stays within current legislative action in Iowa? HF 802 in 2021 basically prohibits race and sexual stereotyping in curriculums and state institutions, but yet allows students to address the current issues in society as they're so important. How does she incorporate this into her?
Whew. With difficulty, Brandon. That's my answer. You incorporated with immense difficulty. I think here's the thing. I like the power of open conversation. And so I think if you ask open questions and then give the students the opportunity to discuss amongst themselves, that might be the safest way to do it, because they might bring up things that you might not be allowed to bring up because of the regulations. I'm not familiar with this rule, so I'm kind of playing it safe with my answer. But I like to have the opportunity to have open discussions. You could have an open discussion about that law, right? What do you all think about this law? What is the potential impact? What were they trying to accomplish? How do you think they did that type of stuff, right? And so I like to give people the space to explore those topics in a safe environment. So what I would do if you decide to go that route and give people the opportunity to engage openly, I would set some ground rules for how those conversations should occur, because like we talked about, these conversations can be really emotional. So I think putting those guardrails and educating the students on how to have the conversation could be really powerful. So yeah, that would be my suggestion there. I hope that's helpful.
It is. Thank you. So we had Lois submit a question during your webinar, and she says, as a librarian in a majority white elementary school, people question my book purchases. Some parents feel that content that stresses racial inequities and or oppression is not appropriate for their kids at their age. What is the best way to approach these types of conversations? Things tend to get more heated when children are involved.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so here's what I would do. Just let's use this as an opportunity to practice the framework, right? So if the person let's assume, I'm going to assume for this example, it's an actual conversation in person, not necessarily in person, but live. You can hear the person's voice. And so instead of defending yourself, you need to use the framework. So let's run it through two ways. So let's say the person says, hey, I don't like this book that you purchased because I don't think my children should be reading this. Then what you would typically say is, no, I should be buying this because it's important for this reason. And then they say, actually, no, that's wrong because of this. Now we're having an argument. There's essentially no path to victory in that situation. So instead, what you do is this. Remember, first of all, in terms of the let's get some negotiation strategy here. You have the advantage because you have the status quo. You already have the book. The book is already there. And so it's not so much about defending your position. The book has been purchased. It's done. It's about making the person feel okay enough to not continue to cause a disruption. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to recognize that a major force behind this is going to be their emotion. So I'm going to address that first. So correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like you're not comfortable with this book purchase. And they're like, yeah, I'm not comfortable about it. I don't think it's right. Okay. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And so you give them the opportunity to share and share and share and share. And you give them the opportunity to share until they cannot share anymore. Good. Okay. And then you say, what would you say in general would be the goal of the library within this school? What should be the goal? Okay, cool. Educate the children, help them to understand things. Okay, now there are going to be certain things that are within that auspice of education that we might not like, but it's important to understand how should we introduce students to some of these concepts that they're going to be introduced in the future, right? And so we just giving them opportunities to speak and share. And you'll be surprised how many times just letting somebody vent can get you to where you want to go. But again, even if this doesn't get you to exactly where you want to go in terms of persuasion, because I have 4 minutes left and I want to get a couple more questions in, it'll help the conversation to be a lot more productive because it diminishes the emotional barrier in the conversation, so you can have a more level-headed conversation. That's where you have secure footing. When we're having a serious conversation that is clear-minded and not negatively impacted by emotions, that's where we want to get, and that's where the conversation becomes easier. I think that's our mantra here for today. How do we make these difficult conversations easier? We can't make them easy, but we can use these frameworks to make them easier.
I want to pair these two questions together. Jerome asks, why are conversations about race in America getting more difficult by the day? And to follow that up, Jude is asking or stating, there is racism on all sides of color lines. Why won't anyone talk about it?
I talk about it. It's in the book. So check that out. Yes, I talk about that too, because it's important to recognize that people are people, and there are going to be biases that are ubiquitous. Bias is the natural state of the brain. So you're going to have biases. So we have to address biases going both ways. We have majority to minority, minority to majority, those type of things. There's no such thing as a conversation where bias doesn't have an impact. There's no objectivity in many cases is a myth. So I have a whole chapter dedicated to those biases and how they impact us for everybody, no matter what race you are. So I think that's important. And I agree with you. I think there's not enough content out there that addresses that. So we have to address it. To Jerome's question, why is it that we have, it seems like these conversations are becoming more emotional and less productive? I think the advent of social media is having an impact, and the growth of media too. Because the thing is, these algorithms are utilized to give us more of what we want. So we live in an echo chamber. So we spend a lot of our time socializing with and listening to ideas that match our own. And so it's very rare that we have an opportunity to be introduced to other ideas that are different from our own. And so the thing is, when we are faced with that, it becomes a threat. It's perceived mentally as like an existential threat. Because again, remember, we're talking about identity and morality. And if somebody has a counter narrative to the way that we're seeing the world, it becomes a threat to who we are as a person, identity, and whether or not we are a good person, morality. So it inflames the emotionality. And let me ask you, let's do a little poll in the chat. How many times have you had a course on negotiation? How many times have you had a course on conflict resolution? How many times? Not very often, right? But we graduate high school knowing how to find the volume, like the area of a triangle. How many times have you used that? But we don't know how to resolve conflict. We grow up and we never learn how to resolve conflict. Fun fact, as a lawyer, Negotiation, conflict resolution, mediation, those were all electives. I could have the majority of lawyers graduate without learning how to negotiate effectively, right? So it's not a lost art. It was an art that was never discovered. And so when we're confronted with more information that just supports our narratives, we're very rarely introduced to counter narratives. And then we have a conversation with somebody who sees the world differently from us. What tools do we have other than the ones we learned in the sandbox as a child? We cry, we argue, we emote, right? So we are dealing with these big issues with absolutely no skills. So that's really one of my real drivers with this. Just get this message out to as many people as possible.
All right, we are at the top of the hour, but a question just came in from Jowanda. Do you want to take one more?
Listen, Brandon, I don't stop. Okay, so of course I want to take one more.
All right, so Jowanda asks, what strategies do you suggest to minimize the frustration of a white person prefacing their conversations with "you people"? This is truly infuriating.
Yes, you people. It's almost become like a running joke for me. Is like you people. It's like, oh, this is going to be fun, right? So here's the thing: we have to do a lot of internal work before having these conversations, and we have to be mindful of what our triggers are. So, like the solution that you use is going to be different from the solution that I use, and we have to be able to be mentally and emotional agile enough and humble enough to figure out what works for you. So one of the things that I talk about in the book, kind of a bit of a radical idea, is called a helpful fiction. This is something that I choose to believe is true, even though I know it's not true. So here's an example. So I believe that I can connect with and persuade anybody. Is that objectively true? No, it's not. But in the conversation, I choose to believe that because I realize that if I don't believe it, there's going to be another belief that comes through, right? It could be a negative bias that doesn't serve me in the conversation. And so I create this helpful fiction to help me through this situation. And so what I would suggest that you do is try to figure out some kind of mental gymnastics that you can use to maintain your emotional stability during that conversation. And so you saw when Brandon brought up the question, I laughed because for me, when I think about some of the classically offensive things, classically offensive, new term, right? The classically offensive things that people say, I smile to myself. I say, okay, this is an important signal of how the conversation is going to go, but I know I'm good enough to work through it, right? And so I would treat that almost like a microaggression, but I would, assuming that it's coming at the front end of a difficult conversation, I would bring that up toward the end, because most likely, I want to make these conversations easier, and my goal is to be effective. My goal is to achieve the goal stated before, like for me in this conversation. And a lot of times, addressing that small issue, it feels big, but ultimately, if I'm trying to move policy, change people's perspectives, trying to get a change in organization, it's usually relatively small. So I have to sequence my goals. They're going to be primary goals and secondary goals, and so I want to sequence that mindfully too. So I'm going to stay focused on what it is. I'm going to register that. I say, okay, remember they said you people at the beginning of the conversation, that will be addressed, but I want to make sure that I'm getting the major goal accomplished in this conversation first. I want to secure that bag before I address that smaller issue, because that smaller issue will become easier to address once you address the big issue. But if you start with the smaller issue, it might not get you to where you want to go, right? So I think it comes down again to the strategy, but also more importantly, doing that internal work to recognize your triggers to make sure you can make those triggers less triggering. There was a great book that I read recently. I'm a father of two, and it's called How Not to Lose Your Stuff with Your Kids. I edited that. And they said your kids will push your buttons, but it's your responsibility to do the work to make your buttons smaller. And so you know very clearly that that's one of those buttons that people can push. So you need to do the internal work to make sure that doesn't take you off track. Because most likely, if you're here having this conversation, listening to this, there's probably a greater good that you are moving toward. So never lose sight of that. And you have to do the work to make sure that your emotions don't take you off track.
Okay. Well, we are going to end things there. Thank you, Kwame. Thank you so much for being here and for your time and very important knowledge today. Truly, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
I also want to extend a huge thank you to all of our audience members for joining us and tuning in to Kwame's Author Talk today. Without your support, none of this would be possible. And we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, below the live stream video, you can find a link to Kwame's book and a link to the American Negotiation Institute in the resources folder. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks on December 6th when we speak to best-selling and Pulitzer Prize-winning author Geraldine Brooks about her newest novel, Horse, and on December 10th when we chat with best-selling author Frederick Bachman about the third and final book in the Beartown series, The Winners. You can register for these and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I am Brandon Adler, and thank you for joining us. Have a great